Good afternoon. This is the story of Linn, who was a boy who lived in a village near a castle many years ago, and who one day, when he walked into the wood, was stolen away by the fairies. It's also the story of a girl called Janet who lived in that castle because her father was the laird, the boss of all that area. He owned the fields, the hills and the woods where the boy was taken away. And Janet, she was allowed to walk in the fields, walk on the hills, and even by the river that ran along, and never, however, was she allowed in the woods. Her father said to her, "You can go anywhere you like, but you are never to go in the woods," because he was obviously afraid that the same thing might happen to her that happened to Linn. But Janet was a young lady of her own mind, and she thought to herself, I'm not going to be told what to do all the time by my father. If I want to go to the woods, then I'm going to go to the woods. So one day, in late October, she walked in the fields. She walked across the hills, down by the side of the river, and then she walked into the dark wood, where the trees were very tall and still and seemed to look down on you. And she took a deep breath and she went down the path into the wood. She could hear little birds calling. She could see occasional bits of autumn fruit which she picked and ate. And eventually she found herself in the middle of the wood by what looked like a stone well, one of those things you used to put a bucket on a rope down to bring up water. And round the well was growing a rose bush, and even at this late month of the year, one single white rose was growing, and she thought, my mother would like that. And she reached out and she picked it and was about to turn round to go home when a voice from above somewhere in the trees said, I'd put that white rose back down if I were you. The fairy queen doesn't like people pinching her flowers. And Janet looked around, but and then she saw somebody lying along this branch was a young man all in silver glittering armour with a big sword, and he was peering down. And she said, no, I'm going to take the flower. I mean, who do you think you are? I'm sorry. I don't believe in all this magic and stuff in the woods, and I'm going. And she was just about to go when, zoom, there he was suddenly, right beside her, the young man in the glittering silver armour. And she looked at him with the flower, and she said, are you by any chance a fairy knight? Yes, I am, said the young man. And are you by any chance a young man called Linn? Well, yes, I am Linn. And you were stolen by the fairies when you were a little boy and you walked into the woods? Yes, that's true. And now I'm a soldier of the fairy queen. I'm one of her knights, and I ride a horse in procession with her when she rides around to see all her magical lands. Janet said with the flower, okay, that's fine, but wouldn't you really like to leave the woods? Wouldn't you like to go home and just be Linn again, because your family actually miss you so much? And when your horse came that day on its own from when you've been riding before you went to the woods, they still think about that. And in the school near my father's castle, they still sing songs about you. Don't you really want to come home? And Linn, the knight, put his sword back in its sheath and said, yeah, I would like to go home. And Janet said, well, how can we do that? And Linn whispered in Janet's ear, giving her instructions about how to help him. And then he was gone, he vanished completely. And Janet thought, right, I'm going to go home and see what I can do. And she walked out of the wood with the white rose back to her castle. Like I said, it was late in October. In fact, it was the last day of October, which, as you know, is Halloween. And there was a big party in the castle, bobbing apples and games and music and fun and people dressed as ghosts. And at a certain point, not long before midnight, Janet crept out of the back door of the castle, pulled her coat around her, and in the dark, but under the light of the bright full moon, she walked down the lane, across the river, over the fields, round about the hills, and into the wood, the dark wood, which was even darker. And as she stepped into the wood, the trees leaned left and right as if to say, who is this coming into our place now? And she could hear owls hooting and sometimes things scurrying, and there were little yellow eyes which peeped at her from dark places. But eventually she came to the centre of the wood and she found the well, and she crouched down by the side of the well and waited. And far off in the village around her father's castle, she heard the village clock begin to chime, ding, 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 midnight on Halloween, the witching and the magical hour. And as the chimes finished, she heard from over there another sound. It was ching, 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 ching. And she thought, I know what that sound is. Ching, 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 ching. That's the sound of a horse being ridden. Ching, 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 ching. And sure enough, a great big horse appeared out of the wood under the moonlight. And there was a woman on the horse with a big cloak wrapped around her and a tall silver crown. And Janet thought, that's the fairy queen. And she had by her side a long dark magic wand. And she rode her horse proudly along. And just behind her there was a knight in silver armour on a black horse with 2 silver gloves, and behind him came a lot of soldiers with spears. And then another horse, a brown horse, with another knight in silver armour and silver gloves, and behind him soldiers with axes. And then there came a white horse, followed by lots of soldiers with swords. But this rider on the white horse was, yes, in glittering silver armour, but he only had 1 silver glove. This hand had no gloves. That was the sign. And Janet leapt up from where she was by the well, and she grabbed the hand of the rider, the hand with no glove, because it was Linn's hand, and she pulled him off the horse onto the ground and held him tight. In that instant the fairy queen screamed, the horse reared up, and she said, who is touching one of my knights? Who has taken him off his horse? And she took her magic wand and she turned in her saddle and she looked and she saw Janet holding Linn closely to her, and she waved the wand Once, twice, 3 times, zoom! And the magic power came and changed Linn into a great big green snake which began to wrap itself around Janet, but she held on. Zoom! Another wave of the wand, and Linn became a big white swan and began to beat Janet with its big wings. More magic. Zoom! Came along, and he turned into a big, tall, dark stag with long antlers, and he began to swish these about, trying to break away from Janet. And then, zoom, more magic, and he became a howling wolf, and he scratched and growled and howled, but she held on to him. And then, in the last desperate piece of magic from the fairy queen, Linn turned into the big branch from a tree, and at this end it was all on fire. And Janet knew at that minute she had all the power she needed. And she stood up over the well and she threw the burning branch down into the water and heard as it struck the deep dark waters, and the fire went out, and the fairy queen screamed a great scream, and she vanished into a cloud of smoke, and all her army with the spears and the axes and the swords vanished from the wood. And out of the well came a very wet but smiling Linn, who shook himself off on the ground. His armour had vanished. And Janet said, Linn, look, dawn is coming. The sun will soon rise. Let us now leave the wood of magic and fairies and go home. And Linn and Janet left, and they walked out of the wood to 1,000 bright mornings. And yes, Janet now did believe in magic and the fairies and the fairy queen, but that was in the past. And Linn and Janet came smiling home, and all was well. Thank you.